Shifting your cybersecurity from reactive to proactive is possible, but to get there, you need a strategy. Cybersecurity strategies today on this episode of the CyberWatch Expert Series. Welcome to the CyberWatch Expert Series. I'm your host, Curtis Franklin. Today, I'm talking with Helen Patton, Cybersecurity Advisor at Cisco, about cybersecurity strategies. And the conversation isn't just about what they are, it's about how you can turn a close look at assets and risks into a strategy that makes a real difference in how your cybersecurity works and how effective it is. Oh, and there's a section you'll want to pay real attention to when we talk about how a strategy can help convince executives that they should be happy making the necessary investment in cybersecurity. And now, my conversation with Helen Patton. Helen, welcome to the CyberWatch Expert Series podcast. We're pleased that you could join us today.
Thanks for having me.
Want to get started by sort of asking you to tell our listeners what was the path that brought you to the point where you're sitting down with me today talking about cybersecurity?
My whole career has been one big accident of timing and opportunity, I guess. So I've been in cybersecurity about 30 years. I started just in IT generically. When I was working in IT in the late 90s, we were dealing with a whole bunch of computer worms, computer viruses, Y2K, all of those things. And the CIO at the time said, we need someone doing security, and Helen, you're it. And so I was voluntold into the industry, which is really common for someone of my era. And then I went to JP Morgan for about a decade. And then I went to the Ohio State University as the CISO for about 8 years. And now I'm at Cisco. And every single time an opportunity came up, it sort of surprised me. I was more often than not, I was asked to take a new role rather than going looking for a role. And if I did go looking for a role, something would change in the organization within about a month of me taking on a new role. And so the job I thought I was signing up for wasn't the job that I ended up getting. And so I ended up writing this book about how do you get into cybersecurity and how do you live and have a career in cybersecurity, and then how do you lead in cybersecurity? And so as a result, here we are having a chat about those kinds of things.
Well, I appreciate the long and winding road that led you to sitting here with me today. I appreciate that. And today we're going to be talking about something that's kind of interesting, and that is a cybersecurity strategy. Because for a lot of people, cybersecurity seems like a very tactical thing. It is something that is almost reactive, and having a strategy makes it seem very proactive. Is that a correct understanding? I mean, is having a strategy part of the key to making it a proactive thing rather than just reactive?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not that there are things that happen in a day-to-day basis that you have to react to. There are certainly, fires that need to be put out in a hurry, for sure. But if you don't have a strategy, it's really easy to get consumed with those day-to-day things. And so having a strategy allows you to do a couple of things. One, it allows you to plan your day, your month, your year, your 3-year, whatever your cycle is, with big picture goals in mind, so that on a day-to-day basis, you can sit and evaluate and work out, am I leading towards something bigger than just putting out today's fire? The other thing is, it's easy to get really burned out in this industry. And if you have a strategy that's a little bit bigger picture, you can really tie your personal values and the reason you're doing cybersecurity in the first place to those really boring or stressful day-to-day job things that you have to do. So it can be a mental health release, and it can also be a, how do I measure progress over months or years or decades kind of thing as well.
Okay, I want to talk about what a strategy is because I can imagine someone who would say, "All right, cybersecurity strategy: don't let bad guys steal our stuff." Next,
Yes.
but I'm assuming that a good strategy will have somewhat more in terms of elements than that.
Yeah, don't get popped is sort of a maybe a baseline value proposition, not necessarily a strategy. There is definitely a difference between a strategy or a strategic plan and a tactic. I like to think of a strategy as something that gives you a higher purpose or a framework way of thinking about why you do what you do. For most organizations and leaders who've thought about this, they have a strategy that somehow ties the security program to the organization that they're working within. So, in at the Ohio State University, for example, as I was thinking about a security strategy there, it's higher education. So there's things like, how do I support research? How do I support student learning? How do I support faculty or staff, right? And so if you think about it through that lens, which is not risk or compliance or those kinds of things, or threat, being able to say, well, what is the bigger purpose for this organization, and how does security line up behind it? And very simply, you can boil it down to certain things. There are certainly outcomes you're looking for, like if we have a security breach, the impact of it can be managed. There can be outcomes like being efficient or effective in the way you do your work. You might have a strategic plan though that talks about growing the technology capabilities of your organization or supporting innovation or those kinds of things. And so it's not just about don't let bad things happen. It's also what are we enabling with the work that we're doing? And so putting that flag on the horizon, and you may never actually achieve your strategic goals. You just might be on a journey towards them. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But being able to plant that flag in the horizon lets everyone around you, your partners, your stakeholders, your team, your vendors, everybody better line up what they do to make sure that you're getting done the things you think are important.
So you've decided that a cybersecurity strategy is a fine thing to have.
Yes.
So, that I guess that's step one, deciding that you need one. And after that, is this something where, especially in a smaller organization, the person who has been tasked with cybersecurity is going to lock themselves away in their office and pull out a legal pad and a pen and write for a while and then come out and announce to the world that they have a strategy? Or is there a different way to get started that will help make this a more useful document?
It's a really good question. I think there are certain elements that go into making up a strategy, and we've talked about some of them already, right? So, one is, what is the compliance landscape that your organization has to live within? If you're retail, you may have something like PCI and card compliance. If you're healthcare, you might have HIPAA compliance and those kinds of regulations, for example, right? Often, organizations that are less mature might start with compliance as sort of the first thing that they look at. Are we in compliance with certain kinds of security regulations and so forth? That might be a thing. For very small and under resourced organizations, that's often the only thing they've got the resources to do. So I know there's a whole industry discussion about, does compliance equal security? And a lot of people would reject that. But in some cases, when that's all you can afford to do, it does equal security, and that's okay, right? So compliance is an element. Threat is an element. A lot of people have security strategies right now that, yes, support the business and all of those things, but very primarily they're about defending against ransomware attacks, for example, right? Because of the operational impact of a ransomware event. So what are the common threats to your company or your industry or your geography or whatever, however you want to scope that? Could be another thing. Um, right now, everyone's chasing the big AI thing, right? So what are the innovations and technology innovations that are going on in your space that you know you're going to need to wrap your hands around? So there are elements like that. And then included in that, what are your budgets? What's the risk appetite of the organization you're a part of? Those kinds of things that sort of will put guardrails or boundaries around what you can and can't do, and also what you should do first, right? So there is sort of that long-term horizon, what do we want to do? But then you get into the tactics of, well, okay, well, how do we get there? So yes, there are all of those elements. Now, does the security leader go into a room and come up with those things and then come out and go, ta-da? Usually not. They might start there, but then they're going to go out to their stakeholders and say, this is what I'm thinking about. This is why I'm thinking about it. We can sort of talk about the why a little bit. Does this sound like a good idea? Does this sound like something that makes sense to you? And so there is a very big communication stakeholder enablement piece that goes along with building a strategy, because you can't execute a strategic plan for cybersecurity without the buy-in of the community that you're doing security for. So you have to be able to make sure that there is a feedback loop of, yes, this is still worth doing. Yes, this is worth doing in the first place, and those kinds of things.
It's interesting that you mentioned the part about the stakeholders and getting buy-in, because it seems to me that this is the sort of document that might help deal with two issues that cybersecurity so often has to struggle against. One is that it is a pure cost, that there is no positive benefit to cybersecurity, just lack of a negative cost in terms of, defending against things. The other is the reputation of cybersecurity as the Department of No. They're always the ones who are going to be slowing you down and telling you why you can't do this amazing new thing that would make life better for everyone if only those darned people in security would let you. Are those the sorts of things that can be dealt with in the process of developing a strategy?
They can help, because if you have a documented strategic plan that you've got stakeholder buy-in, and then someone comes to you and says, oh, look, bright, shiny new thing. We want to go do this bright, shiny new thing. As a security leader, you've then got sort of a backstop to say, look, we've agreed on this strategic plan, and that strategic plan may include things like having a zero trust architecture or dealing with technology debt, for example, those kinds of things. When that new request comes through, you can evaluate it against the strategic plan. If it's neutral to the plan, or if it contradicts, or if it supports the plan, you can go, great, carry on, good job. If for some reason it contradicts the plan, then you've got a reason to sort of be the Department of No if you feel like you need to do that. I reject the notion that security people are the Department of No, or at least I don't think they have to be. I think there's a way where you can say, well, you can choose to do this, but if you choose to do this, these are the risks you're taking. The business has to sign off on those risks and so forth, right? So it's a risk management decision, not just a Helen just doesn't think that's a good idea decision. But I think having that framework of the strategic plan gives you the language and the context in which to have that difficult conversation, if indeed it needs to be a difficult conversation at all.
It was interesting to me that, we've been talking about the bright, shiny new thing. And I've had conversations with some people as part of this series. And those conversations have involved the fact that the threat landscape, the specifics of the threat landscape, can shift pretty rapidly in cybersecurity. It's a rare month that goes by when we don't have some sort of new campaign, piece of malware, something developing. Should the strategic document, the cybersecurity strategy, be broad enough to deal with this shifting landscape, or does the nature of cybersecurity mean that the cybersecurity strategy is going to be a more fluid document because of the change in the risk landscape?
It's a really good question. I think a strategic plan should encompass an understanding that the threat landscape changes very quickly. I don't think if you've got a strategic plan that is so specific as to the tactics and techniques of attackers, you haven't got a strategic plan. You've got a reactive incident response document. It's not the same thing. But I do think what we see in the industry, I think, is that there are certain classes of attack that emerge that become collectively big enough that they could become an element of a strategic plan to deal with that kind of thing. So we saw it when the SolarWinds breach event happened, and people were thinking about not only supply chain attacks but software supply chain attacks and those kinds of things. And so that class of how do we make sure our build environments are secure? How do we make sure that the software being developed for the security tooling or the IT tooling that we have in our environments from our vendors makes sense, which then led to things like security bills of materials being produced and those kinds of things. So you may have a strategic plan that includes things like hardening your build process. And that came out of some kind of industry event that became bigger than just Log4j or whatever the situation was. But I think if you're down at that very individual tactic level, you're probably too in the weeds to be able to call it a strategic plan. Now, if you're in a certain industry where that one tactic or that one threat is so significant that you have to deal with it, well, you have to deal with it, but that's not a strategic plan. That's just incident response.
We've talked about some of the elements. We've talked about sort of the broad strokes and all that. But if someone, again, is sitting down and has been told they need to do this, is there someplace they can go to get guidance on how to get started? I mean, are there frameworks? Are there best practices? Where could someone go to help them take that first step?
So I'm going to do a shameless plug. I'm part of a committee of folks that are part of a project called the Cybersecurity Canon Project. And the Cybersecurity Canon Project is a bunch of people who get together and read books about cybersecurity, review those books, and then make recommendations about whether those books are any good or not. Within that grouping of reviewed books, there are certain books that have made it into the Cybersecurity Canon Hall of Fame, which means they're timeless, they're valuable, they're all of the things. Within that, there's a few books that talk about security strategy. So there is the CISO Compass by Todd Fitzgerald. There is the CISO Desk Reference by Gary Hayslip, Matt Stamper, and Bill Bonney. There is a whole there's 3 or 4 different how do you lead a team kind of books in the cybersecurity canon. So I think there's certainly books that you can go and have you can go and read and absorb. I think the other thing, though, is you cannot go wrong by networking with the cybersecurity community. So go find security leaders in your industry, maybe in your geography, maybe in your particular size of organization, if you're a startup versus a Fortune 100, whatever. Find a representative sample of those kinds of things and go ask them, 1, how have they done their planning? But 2, what's in their strategy today and why? Most importantly, why? Because it's just because another company that's in healthcare just like you or is the same size just like you has done something doesn't mean that's the right thing for your organization. It might be they may have a plan that's got elements in it because of the management culture of their organization that doesn't look anything like yours, for example. Or they may have had a breach 2 years ago, and so they're under some consent order that they've got to do something where you don't have that problem. So go and talk to people and network and find out what they're doing, but always think critically about whether it makes sense for your organization or not.
That seems eminently sensible. That's always a good thing. So it's hard to believe, but we're coming down toward the end of our time together. This has flown past. And one of my last questions to you is if there's a central thought or maybe a couple, that you want people to leave this conversation with, what would that be?
Couple of things. When you're writing a security strategy, it shouldn't probably be less than a year, or what you're dealing with is tactics. But on the other hand, trying to write a strategy that goes 10 years into the future is probably unrealistic given the nature of change that we deal with. So finding the sweet spot, and the sweet spot again might depend on your industry. In a technology company, your strategy might be 18 months to 2 years. In education, it might be 2 years to 5 years, right? So think about what makes sense. Rick Howard, in his book Cybersecurity First Principles, suggested 3 years, not longer than 3 years. So one, time bound your strategy, but give it enough time that you're thinking in terms of longer term goals. Number one. Number two, I do think you can't actually create a strategy in a vacuum. So making sure that you are getting feedback from your team, your immediate team probably to start with, technology teams, business partners, company leadership, super important. And then three, I would say network. Not only networking so that you learn how to write a strategy, but things are going to wobble as you deliver the strategy, and you're going to need support around you to say, are we still doing the right thing? Could I be doing this a different way? Those kinds of things. It's so important to have that support group around you who aren't your immediate organization, to be able to give you an outside-in view of whether or not you're on the right path. So network, for sure, is the third thing.
Well, speaking of networking, if people wanted to keep up with you and your thoughts on cybersecurity and strategy, or do you have a blog? Are you on social media? How can they do that?
Probably the easiest way is to find me on LinkedIn. I do have my own website. You can find that at cisohelen.com, and there's a contact page in there if you want to reach out to me directly. You on that page, you will find all my blogs and writings and things there as well. So cisohelen.com is probably the right place to find me.
Fabulous. Well, Helen, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We'll look forward to the opportunity to have another conversation with you in the future.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, that was my conversation with Helen Patton. I appreciate Helen taking the time to be with us today. Join me next week for the CyberWatch Expert Series, when I'll have another experienced expert who will help you gain the information you need to be more successful at making your organization more secure. This podcast has been brought to you by Access Point Consulting. Follow along with the CyberWatch Expert Series on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And as always, you can learn more about Access Point Consulting at www.accesspointconsulting.com. I'm Curtis Franklin. We'll see you next week.